This episode is sponsored by Krim. Krim skillfully designs and manufactures professional coffee equipment like their Onyx manual espresso machines, Coffee Queen filter brewers, and Unity, their fully automatic coffee makers. These sleek, versatile, and reliable machines come with proactive service plans to ensure a differentiated and seamless coffee experience for coffee professionals and enthusiasts. Find out more at crim.coffee. You're listening to the Coffee Podcast. This is the Coffee Science Series, Brewing Better with Chemistry. In this episode, we talk about what discoveries have been made at the Coffee Center at UC Davis and what might be next. We also dive a little deeper into chemistry topics regarding brewing coffee and what has thus far been discovered. I hope you walk away, like I have, from this conversation with brew experiments you can perform at home. Also, I'd like you to have some new tips that might improve how you brew your coffee at home. Bill Ristenpart is the founding director of the Coffee Center at UC Davis in California. His background is in chemical engineering, which he defines as, quote, a way of using science to convert raw materials into a more desired form, end quote. In the context of coffee, he says,
that's exactly what every coffee industry professional around the world is doing. They're taking a raw material, some coffee cherries, and then turning it into, at the end of the day, a delicious beverage. And there's a lot of really complicated chemistry and physics and microbiology and a whole bunch of other scientific disciplines that go into that process.
Bill founded the Coffee Center, and it all started with a course using coffee to teach concepts about chemistry. Kind of like how we talk about coffee on the podcast, but it's also a vehicle for all kinds of other conversations.
When I first got into coffee, kind of academically around 2012, 2013, I had no idea that I'd be doing coffee research someday. I was interested in coffee just from a pedagogical point of view. I wanted to use coffee as a way of illustrating, of teaching core scientific engineering principles to students. There's lots of students who go through the university and never in their wildest dreams would they ever imagine that they would take a chemical engineering course, right? Like not many students would go sign up for Introduction to Chemical Engineering. But if you call it the design of coffee, an introduction to engineering, then that really piques people's curiosity, and then you can start talking about some of these really complicated things. And so I founded the Coffee Center after the class blew up in popularity, and we started making contacts with people in the coffee industry and the Specialty Coffee Association, and it became clear to us that there was a tremendous amount of interest in not just teaching, but also in research.
What about your personal interest with coffee? Because I know our listeners like to hear a little bit about when did you start drinking coffee, or what is it about coffee outside of your experience at UC Davis and using it as that sort of teaching tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know coffee definitely got me through graduate school. Without that, I wouldn't have made it. Before about 2010 or so, I was a very utilitarian coffee drinker. I would just drink whatever was caffeinated. I grew up. My parents drank a lot of instant coffee and things like that, so I didn't really know about specialty coffee. My kind of awakening, I guess, is I was on a road trip with my family up to Vancouver in Canada, in British Columbia, and we stopped at a kind of a gourmet donut place that my family was very excited about. And they had some specialty coffee in there, and I didn't know what it was at the time. And I had some black coffee, and when I tasted it, I was like, why did they adulterate this with oranges? There's like orange peel flavor in here. This is, and I was kind of outraged. And the barista was very kind and patient. Said, no, that's there naturally. It's the flavor that comes out. And I can't remember the details of the coffee, but like that was my first introduction to the idea that like you could actually have some pretty exotic flavors in coffee. And after that, I became a bit more obsessed about it. And then a couple of years later, I had an opportunity to start teaching that class, and then I really got into it.
You have a pretty fun angle on this coffee thing. So, in a world where anyone can point to, say, like a white paper or, there's a lot of access to information on the internet. And maybe they say something like, aha, I understand the mystery, or I found the answer. What sets the UC Davis Coffee Center apart from other research happening in coffee?
So that's a great question. And I should give some more perspective on what the Coffee Center is. And so it's not just me and a few students. There's actually about 40 faculty on campus in a variety of different disciplines. I'm in chemical engineering, so I think about the dynamics of extraction and roasting in detail, but I have colleagues who do sensory and consumer science, colleagues who do social science, colleagues who do agronomy and plant science, plant pathology, even colleagues in the law school and the business school. So what brings all of those together, and to answer your question, is that we approach things from kind of a academic, rigorous point of view. And so in my own discipline in science, we aren't convinced by random opinions that we read about on the website somewhere. We need hard data to corroborate things. And so that's one thing that I've been really excited about recently in our research focused on the coffee tasters flavor wheel and the coffee brewing control chart. So we're bringing rigorous hard data to really answer the question, how does coffee taste as a consequence of how you brew it?
So you've already talked, you just brought it up, the coffee brew control chart.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? Well, let's talk about a little bit about what it is. I know some of my listeners are familiar because we've brushed on this before. But what is it, and why is it so important to your research?
So the coffee brewing control chart, it's a graph, it's a chart that was originally developed by a fellow named Ernest Lockhart in the 1950s. He was a chemist and food scientist and a director of something called the Coffee Brewing Institute. So the brewing control chart, the goal is to relate how you brew the coffee to what it tastes like. And so if your listeners Google it, they'll find the classic form of it, where on the vertical axis is how strong your coffee is. So that's the total dissolved solids. So literally how much stuff is dissolved into your cup of water, right? That's the vertical axis. And the horizontal axis is the extraction yield, or percent extraction. And what that refers to is how much of the soluble material in the coffee grounds did you rip out of the solid phase and put into the liquid phase. Those two quantities are independent. So you can have 3 different cups of coffee that all have exactly the same strength, the same TDS, but they'll taste wildly different because they had different extraction yields. And so those two quantities, the extraction yield and the brew strength, are linked by the brew ratio. And so that's traditionally how coffee brewers have thought about the brewing control chart. They modify their brew ratio and some of the other parameters to get a desired brew profile. And the classic target brew is in this range of 1.15 to 1.35% TDS and 18 to 22% extraction. So right in the center of the chart. And so that's the classic version that's been around since the 1950s.
And it sounds like that version has not necessarily aged well with the research. Is that?
Well, no, I think Lockhart had a very brilliant insight. So before then, everybody was just kind of shooting in the dark. But what he pointed out was that if you had high extraction yields, that would be associated with pretty bitter beverages. Whereas if you had low extraction yields, it would be what they refer to as underdeveloped, which is kind of like grassy or sour or nutty notes.
Gotcha.
And so in terms of aging well, I mean, like those insights are not incorrect. But if you compare the classic coffee brewing control chart to the modern coffee taster's flavor wheel, you'll see a huge mismatch because on the control chart, you basically have just 2 sensory notes, either underdeveloped or bitter. But if you look at the coffee taster's flavor wheel, you'll see there's like 104 or so different attributes or flavors that can be detected in coffee, like, for example, that orange or citrusy note that I was so shocked by a decade ago. And so where is that? Like, so if you want to highlight the citrusy flavor in a specialty coffee, how do you brew it? So that's the information that's been missing. And that's in terms of what sensory scientists refer to as the sensory descriptive attributes. And so, what does it taste like? The thing that's perhaps easier to criticize is the pronounced emphasis on the kind of ideal range. So in terms of consumer preferences, the classic brewing control chart is kind of one size fits all. It says there's this one ideal range right here in the middle. And, you can just look around any coffee shop and you see, like, wait a second, different people like different things. How can there be a one-size-fits-all approach? And so that's something else we've been doing. We've been doing a tremendous amount of consumer testing, at least of our kind of Northern California demographic here. And we've been finding that preferences for black coffee are tremendously much more diverse than the classic chart would suggest. And so we have a paper, just to elaborate on that, we have a paper in peer review right now where we've identified kind of 2 major clusters or cohorts of consumers. One we call the sweet lovers, and they actually prefer much lower strength and lower extraction coffees. So kind of in that bottom left corner of the classic brewing control chart. They strongly disliked the stronger brews. And the other cohort, they're much more complicated. We call them the extremophiles. They responded very favorably to basically the opposite. They preferred either really strong, kind of sour brews up in the top left corner, or really strong and bitter brews over on the far right side of the chart. And what's really notable about our research is that neither group preferred the coffees that were brewed right in the classic ideal zone, first promulgated by Lockhart. So it really just goes to show that, once you start getting rigorous data, consumer data, the picture is much more complicated than was previously thought.
Yeah, and that leaves a lot of room, I think, for anybody who's in a position brewing coffee for a consumer to get creative or to get some feedback loops and, figure out like, what do my customers want? Where maybe do they fit? That's some really important information, I think, even as a coffee shop owner or something, especially during this time where COVID's become quite a variable. And so knowing those things and understanding those things about your customers are going to help you to make good decisions to, generate some revenue, I'd imagine.
No, absolutely. So, baristas are extremely skilled, but in some sense, there's a lot of trial and error. How do you maximize the blueberry notes, for example, in a Yirgacheffe? Our goal is to have, a chart that really provides some guidance, like how do we maximize desired sensory attributes? And so once you know how you can make it, then you can also use some of the consumer information we're putting to have a little insight on like what types of consumers might like the different flavor profiles that you put together.
Sounds really fun. So we're going to jump into some technical talk here, get some definitions under our belt, and maybe get a little bit of understanding of some technical bits before we dive into some more of a conversation about discovery, research, and things like that. And my first question is, what is the chemical life cycle for a seed of coffee from plant to brew?
Sure. So that's an extremely broad question. So green coffee seeds have about 400 different chemical species present, and then when you roast, the number balloons upwards. So there's more than 1,000 different molecules that contribute to the flavor and the aroma of coffee. That's kind of a very broad question. One of my colleagues in the coffee center, from not a chemical perspective, but from just kind of a mass perspective, my colleague is in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at UC Davis, Erwin Donis Gonzalez. His expertise is in post-harvest processing, and so I've been collaborating with him. We've been doing kind of a mass flow analysis from harvest to cup of coffee, focusing on the wet process and method prevalent Central and Latin America. One really fascinating thing about coffee, compared to many other academic disciplines, is that things that were studied like decades ago for other commodities, other products, for example, wine, just have not happened to the same extent in coffee. And so there's just a huge kind of void in the academic literature. That's one of the goals of the Coffee Center, is to fill those voids.
That's been a major theme in our discussion over the production of this series, is that gap that, I've heard some people even call it the coffee is like an orphaned agricultural product.
That's 100% true. 100% true. UC Davis, I think, is a great example of this. We have a world-class department of viticulture and enology, and that's the growing of grapes and the making of wine. And that department actually dates back to the founding of the University of California back in the 1880s. It was actually written into the state constitution that when the University of California is founded, it'll have, among other things, faculty focus on that. My colleagues in that department like to joke that it would be unconstitutional to shut down their department. But there was no such department for coffee. And the simple reason is that even back in the 1880s, Napa Valley and the wine industry had enough political power to, demand that, whereas coffee was not grown here to any extent in the United States. And so that's why academically, that disparity just got kind of baked in, at least in the United States, and never was really rectified.
What is I guess it's titratable acidity. Am I saying that right?
You are. Titratable acidity.
Okay.
So titratable acidity is a measure of how acidic something is. And so for your listeners who don't know, a titration is where you figure out how much acid is present by slowly adding a base to neutralize it. And then you can measure how much acid is there basically by keeping track of how much base you have to add to neutralize it. People are familiar with pH, or they have a sense of what a pH scale is. Titratable acidity, in contrast to pH, measures basically all the acids present. So pH measures strong acids, whereas titratable acidity measures weak acids as well. And the thing about coffee and many other food products like wine and things like that, your tongue doesn't respond to pH; it responds to titratable acidity. Your tongue is good at sensing weak acids, not just strong acids as well. And so we've been doing research trying to correlate perceived sourness with the titratable acidity present in brewed coffee.
Cool. Yeah, that's a fun one. I think to dive more into, but for now we'll leave it there. We'll move on to
We
some.
have a whole seminar just on the tidal acidity
Yeah,
question.
right.
Yeah,
And that's available to the public, right? Something we can link to.
I think so. Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, like my students gave a bunch of SCA Expo talks, and
Hmm.
I believe those are
Right.
available online.
What or how should we as I mean, I'm sure some of us are chemists of some kind, but I think the majority of us don't have or don't live in that world. So what is an organic acid versus say a non-organic acid?
Sure. So organic to a lot of consumers means, you go to the grocery store, you see organic produce. There, that means that the vegetables or fruits or whatever were grown without pesticides. Okay. And so that's very different from the
Hmm.
way that a chemist uses the phrase organic. Organic to a chemist just means that the molecules contain carbon. And so the discipline of organic chemistry is really the discipline of how carbon atoms link up with other atoms to form molecules like caffeine or sucrose or, furfuryl alcohol or a thousand other molecules that are present in coffee, most of which are
Okay.
organic.
So, for myself to reiterate, it's sort of the idea of the relationships between carbon molecules.
Yeah, that's probably the most succinct way of saying what organic chemistry is. Yeah,
Okay.
inorganic
Okay.
chemistry is like silicon and other things that don't contain carbon. But
Okay.
but
Okay.
people are carbonic. People are organic molecules basically strung together. And coffee is also
Okay.
mostly organic molecules suspended in water.
Very cool. My next question, it's I guess similar. What compounds in coffee give it varying sensory experiences? I know like umami.
Sure. So that's a really complicated question. And so when you're looking to identify, for example, the citrusy note that I
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, what causes that? It's not like if you remember Star Trek, where Mr. Spock would like wave his tricorder over something and then start telling you that there are some weird chemicals present. To
Okay.
figure out what molecules are present is really complicated. You have to use something called mass spectrometry, and so
Okay. Yeah.
and so it's a very laborious. You basically need a PhD caliber student to run the mass spec equipment. And what that does is then it tells you what molecules are present in the brew. Then you have to couple that information with what it actually tastes like. And so you have to imagine that you're faced with this list of 1,000 different chemicals, and then you're trying to say, oh, this one had a more citrusy note, or at least that's what I perceived. Which of those 1,000 molecules was more? So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not. That's why there's a whole discipline of people doing food chemistry and food sensory trying to
Hmm.
identify. Some molecules are very easy to identify. Like so, citrus. A lot of the citrusy flavor that you associate with like lemon peels. There's a molecule,
Hmm.
an organic molecule called limonene,
Okay.
which is responsible for that. Limonene is also present in coffee, and so there's a good chance that much of the citrusy note might be correlated with a higher concentration of limonene.
Okay.
But even in lemons and oranges and things like that, it's not just that one molecule that does that, right? And so it's
Yeah.
really complicated to figure out from a kind of a fundamental chemical perspective which molecules are responsible for which flavor profiles in a beverage that's as complicated as coffee.
Yeah, I love the complicated nature of it because it's so easy to take a sip of something like coffee and enjoy it and just to think like, oh yeah, there's just a few things happening, but there's a whole world of things happening chemically, right?
Absolutely. I love to tease my wine colleagues, the faculty over there, because they know how complicated wine is. There's different,
Uh-huh.
like tartaric acid and different molecules that affect the flavor of wine, and they love to talk about how that is linked to the terroir. And then I'll stand up and say, actually, coffee's more complicated than wine, and they kind of like spit, and they
Oh,
spit their coffee, they
mic
spit their
drop.
coffee out and get all outraged. But I mean, I think you can arguably make a good case that coffee is a much more complicated beverage than wine,
Hmm.
both chemically and also in terms of its production. The wine folks really they know how hard it is to make wine. You have to not only grow the
Mm-hmm.
grapes, but then you have to do the fermentation and then do the all the steps that go into that afterwards. Coffee actually has what a chemical engineer refers to as unit operations. Coffee actually goes through more unit operations. Many of them are actually done at origin, so they're kind of out of sight, out of mind. And then here you can get the impression like, oh, coffee's easy. All you do is pour hot water over it, and
Yeah.
that's kind of like saying, oh, wine is easy. All you have to do is open the bottle. So it's not. Someday I'd love to write an article called "Coffee is More Difficult Than Wine."
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah,
man. Yeah, I could see that blowing up. I definitely would pass that around. Yeah. I love the complexity there and the idea that there's all this mapping that has to happen. I guess in the research, it's not just as simple as looking at a molecule or a compound. It goes beyond that into the sensory realm to see what is being perceived and what's present. There's all this stuff going on.
Yeah, I've had a great time. I collaborate closely with Professor Jean-Xavier Guinard in the Department of Food Science. He's a sensory expert, and so I've learned. I'm a
Cool.
chemical engineer. I've learned a ton from him. And what I've learned is that, like,
Nice.
in some sense, a lot of the classic things we study in chemical engineering are kind of easy compared to trying to understand what people like. People are way more complicated, and so just even a simple
Yeah.
question like which of these coffees, if you brew it differently, tastes best, it's got a really complicated answer with different cohorts. Some people like this, some people like that. So
Yeah.
gets really challenging.
Well, before we jump into some of the discovery conversation about the research, what is transport phenomena? And it's somehow related to mass transfer, I guess. What is all this?
Sure, yeah. So transport phenomena is the name that scientists have given to basically the idea of how do molecules move around from one place to another. But it's not just molecules; it can also be fluids, or it can be energy like heat. It's basically how do things move around. It is a little confusing when I told my parents I was studying transport for grad school. They said, like, what is that? Is that like bus schedules? Like, what do you mean by that? Like and no, it's for example, coffee is a beautiful example of lots of different manifestations of transport phenomena. The easiest one to visualize is coffee brewing. And so there, the transport question is, well, you have all these yummy molecules in the solid phase. How do you get them into the liquid phase? And one answer is like, oh, you just pour water over it. That's fine if you just want to have some brown liquid. But if you want to really control the flavor profile, then you have to really think carefully about how the different parameters affect the transport, affect the mass transfer to get a desired target brew. And that's why our research about the coffee brew control chart is so exciting, is because like how you pour the water over it. In other words, how long you brew it for, what grind size you use, in terms of affecting the extraction yield and the brew strength, has a huge impact on what it tastes like. And so that's what transport refers to. I think actually one interesting anecdote is, for our consumer testing, we had more than 100 different people come in over 3 different weekends and taste, almost 30 coffees. And they tasted them all blind. They didn't know what they were tasting. And naturally, at the end, they're very curious, like, so what coffees were we tasting? And we said, oh, actually, it was the same coffee the whole time, just brewed differently. And it blew their minds. They were like, what? We thought we were tasting like all these different exotic coffees. They tasted so differently just by virtue of the fact of how we brewed it.
Yeah.
And effectively, what we were doing there was we were just changing the mass transfer.
This kind of information from somebody who likes to control their brew at home can be either overwhelming or really exciting, right? The idea that you can almost like take any coffee and treat it differently to get the best results, and even that best word being best to you, obviously. So
no,
okay,
absolutely, yeah. I mean, so I went camping last week with my family. I was able to get out for the first time in several months. And it was just experimenting with the French press, doing very, very long brews and very short brews. And it's just amazing, like how differently it can taste. Same coffee, same water temperature, same grind size and everything. Just minor differences in brew time and full immersion French press method really made a difference.
Nice. Very fun. Well, I want to dive a little bit into the discovery piece of the research that you've been a part of over there at UC Davis. In your opinion, what have been some of the most surprising discoveries you've observed during your time there?
So I think one thing that we're very excited about right now is that we repeated the coffee brew and control chart experiments, which it's very laborious because you have to brew it up to different brew strengths and different extraction yields over the entire chart, right?
Yeah.
And we repeated it all at different temperatures. And so some of your listeners might be familiar with the gold cup brewing standard put out by the SCA. Some coffee brewers that are more expensive typically have more control over the temperature of the water that we're putting in there. And so we're very curious about this. And so we did a bunch of tests where we systematically varied the brew temperature from about 87 degrees Celsius up to about 93 degrees Celsius. What we did was we did brews where we fixed the brew strength and we fixed the extraction yield, but varied the brew temperature that was used to get there. So, if we used a lower brew temperature, then we'd just brew it slightly longer so that we would get to the target brew strength. And that way we could do a head-to-head comparison of coffees that were brewed at different temperatures, but at the end of the day, when they were actually tasted by our expert panel, had the same TDS, the same total dissolved solids, the same brew strength, and the same extraction yield. We did all that work because we thought, that it would make a big difference. And basically what we found, and we have a paper in review right now at Scientific Reports, showing that, like, statistically speaking, there was no difference at all.
Oh my gosh.
So
that's super meaningful, right? Because if you can save time,
you can
like, I would imagine that's a major variable.
There's a bunch of different implications, and I just want to be really clear. It's like we're not saying that temperature doesn't matter. Clearly, the temperature matters. Like if you brew with hotter water, the mass transfer is faster. It'll brew more quickly. But what I'm talking about is if you control the brew time such that you use different temperatures, but get to the same endpoint, get to the same brew strength and the same extraction yield. What temperature water you used to get there didn't matter. Both our expert panel, they couldn't really discern a difference. Our consumer panel, no significant difference in what people liked either. And so there's basically, it tasted the same effectively. And so the implications of that, there's a bunch. I mean, so yes, you could use hot water and brew it more quickly, or you could use lower temperature water, save energy, right? And just let it brew a little bit longer and get to the same point, right?
Yeah.
And so it also suggests that the kind of Gold Cup brewer standard right now might be a little bit ill-posed, because right now, if a brewer doesn't get to a hot enough temperature quickly enough, then it fails. It doesn't pass.
I see.
Doesn't pass certification. Whereas what our results are showing is like, well, actually, what a high quality brewer should have, it shouldn't have to hit certain target specs in terms of like how quickly it gets to a very narrow temperature range and then holds it the whole time. It should have much more, in my opinion, have much more control over the flow rate and the what we call the water pulsing duty cycle.
Okay.
And so just by changing how often you add the water and how quickly, you can change the brew time, even using lower temperature water, right? And then you can, aim for a target brew strength.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I know even since you and I talked first, I started to implement a lot more agitation in my brew and at home. And I have had fantastic results with that. Actually lowering the temperature, more agitation, like the combination. But
yeah, no, sure. Absolutely. I mean, like the transport, the mass transfer is accelerated by agitation, by stirring, because you have what a scientist would refer to as a convective contribution to the flux, and that's just a fancy way of saying that moving the
that's so fancy.
moving the liquid around helps maximize the concentration gradients and therefore maximize the diffusive flux out of the coffee grounds. And so there is kind of there's a huge sustainability implication there too, because going back to your question about the whole kind of life cycle of coffee, researchers have done work trying to figure out what's the energy costs of making coffee, and if you do kind of an energy balance over the whole thing, from planting the coffee trees to harvesting and the gasoline to move the tractors around, like the shipping costs, the roasting, there's a lot of steps that require a bunch of energy. But at the end of the day, when you're making a cup of coffee in a cafe, it's almost half of the total energy in that cup of coffee is just from just from heating the water. Anything you can do, if you can like minimize the amount of energy used for heating the water in that final step, that actually decreases the total energy consumption for the entire coffee supply chain by like a significant amount.
Significant chunk. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's huge. We talked a little bit about some of your most fascinating observations, and I wanted to jump a little bit into some topics about, pardon me for a second, perceived sourness, titratable acids correlating to TDS, extraction yield versus TDS, these sorts of things. Can you give us a little bit of context to that?
Sure. So we have a paper in preparation right now linking titratable acidity to total dissolved solids. When I first started getting into coffee, just looking around on the web, there was a lot of discussion about how the acids present in coffee are more soluble, so they come out into solution more quickly. And so based on that, I kind of anticipated that if you do a bunch of brews and then measure the titratable acidity versus the brew strength, that it would basically be a nonlinear relationship. But what we're finding is, at least over all the range of brew stinks, what we're finding is that the titratable acidity present in coffee always strongly linearly correlated with the TDS, even at very, very high extraction yields and even at very, very high brew strengths. And what's even more fascinating is that the temperature of water that you use to brew that only affects it very weakly. So the total dissolved solids is a really, really good predictor of the titratable acidity.
Oh, wow. Okay. So as a barista or somebody brewing at home, what should I take out of that information?
If you just take a step back and look at the totality of the research that's coming out of the Coffee Center over the past couple of years, what is really showing is how paramount, how important the total dissolved solids is. The TDS by far is the best predictor of the different sensory attributes that are present in the coffee brewing control chart that we're making.
Okay.
Like I just mentioned, it's a strong predictor for the titratable acidity, which is strongly linked to the perceived sourness. It's also, that's the parameter that people respond to by far the most for the consumer testing. So I think kind of a key take-home message, I think, is that if you're not kind of measuring your TDS now as a matter of course, if you're a professional barista somewhere, then you may want to consider doing that soon, because it's a really, like if you use a digital refractometer, it's like a 5-second measurement. just one little drop on
Hmm.
the thing. It doesn't take a ton of training, and it can provide a lot of insight. I mean, if your customers are saying, "Oh, it's too sour" and whatnot, and you go back and measure your TDS, like it's off the charts
Uh,
compared to before, then you know something went wrong somewhere, right? And so
yeah.
that's, I think,
So
a useful feedback tool.
especially during this time, my question there would be, VST devices, or I'm sorry, I mentioned VST, but really I mean TDS devices can be super expensive.
Hmm.
And is there any like in between? Is there anything affordable for coffee shop owners or whoever who, they don't have that kind of budget?
Yeah, you just mentioned one brand, but the thing about digital refractometry is that you don't need to use any particular brand. So any type of refractometer will work as long as you have a proper calibration scheme. So some people actually use Brix meters. Are you familiar with Brix?
Okay. I just know it from wine. It's
Yeah.
been brought up, but I've
Yeah,
never dealt with bricks myself.
degrees Brix. That's just a technical name for how much sugar is present in water. So one
Mm.
degree Brix is 1% of a mass of sugar in water. I'm writing up a new coffee brewing handbook, and one of the chapters is going to be, or is, I finished it, is on digital refractometry, and like basically describes how that works and how you can
Oh, sweet.
use less expensive options and how to make your own calibration curve, for example. I think it doesn't have to be $800, $900. You can get a much cheaper Brix meter, especially if you're in a cafe environment. I think it's a good investment because it helps
Mm.
provide some insight on how your coffee might be drifting versus time, or how different flavor profiles are correlated with a TDS. And the thing about once you know the TDS, you also know you can calculate what your extraction yield was as well. So it also gives you important insight on how effectively you're using the coffee and where you are in terms of the overall coffee brewing control chart. So
Got you.
it's a really good investment for any cafe that is serious about serving specialty coffee.
So, question for you, just out of application: if you're using some kind of mineral water, it's already going to have dissolved solids in there, right? The
Correct.
idea.
Yeah.
So you would just take the difference between the measurement of the water and the measurement of the brew. Is that the idea?
Yes, you can, but unless you're using like ocean water or something, the difference between a brewed cup of coffee and water is huge. It's going to be in the noise, basically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, so like typical like hard tap water is like 500 ppm,
Mm-hmm.
whereas a cup of coffee is like 13,000 ppm,
Oh, okay. I
right?
see.
And so what is it? It's like a 0.05 percent difference or so. And so normally what people recommend is you calibrate or zero your refractometer with distilled water, which has is close
Mm-hmm.
to zero ppm. But then I'd recommend doing calibrations with whatever water you're using for the brew, and then
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Well, that makes total sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
then
cool. I'm looking forward to that. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, like if you really want to get into it, then you can make an actual calibration curve with some other type of refractometer that's not designed specifically for coffee. But if you can just make a bunch of solutions with instant coffee, because the nice thing about instant coffee is that it dissolves, 100% of it dissolves, and so
Yeah.
for example,
Oh,
you
okay.
can add 1 gram of instant coffee to 99 grams of water, and if you have a scale that allows that precision, now you have a 1% TDS coffee solution, and then you can go and see what your refractometer, what does that measure for that. You do that a few times for
Shoot.
1 gram or 1.5 grams or 2 grams. Now you have a calibration curve, and you're good to go using whatever Bix meter or refractometer that you have.
Nice. Well, I'm going to ask you at the end about some experiments we can do at home, but we're already tackling some that sound really fun, so I'm excited we got into that already. We've talked about mass transfer, and you mentioned to me before something about mass transfer coefficient,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm curious, what does this represent, and what does it have to do with your research?
So we have to get a little technical. So a mass transfer
Great.
coefficient is a parameter where you lump all the things that you don't know into one parameter, and you figure it out experimentally. And so in the discipline of mass transfer, like there's complicated but well-known analytical results for how, for example, a perfect sphere will undergo mass transfer and allow something to move out into solution, as a function of something called the Reynolds number, which can measure the convective contribution. Coffee is not a perfect sphere, and it's rarely under well-characterized fluid flow conditions. You basically, it's very difficult to measure. So what you do
Okay.
is instead, and this is not just for coffee, it's for like a lot of different disciplines. You'll do some experiments, correlate the observed flux. So that's how quickly the stuff moves out of the solid phase into the liquid phase. You
Okay.
measure that, and then you correlate it in terms of the concentration difference, and then you fit it with what's known as this mass transfer coefficient. And so typically everything that you don't know about the diffusive flux, the convective flux, the temperature dependence, all that stuff is subsumed within K as the mass transfer coefficient traditionally. and you stick it in
Okay.
there. So basically what that means in practice is that if you're doing experiments under similar conditions where K was measured before, then you can use that K again. So it's an empirical coefficient.
And I guess this has nothing to do with time travel. So, like, if we stored the flux in some kind of
Yeah.
capacitor, this
So,
is not.
so I use that joke in my lecture I'll put up a picture of the Back to the Future and the flux capacitor when I'm
Okay.
introducing
Yeah.
this concept of flux, and whenever I show it to older audiences, and by that I mean like older than 30 or so, typically everybody starts laughing as soon as they see it because they get the joke right away. When I show it to 18-year-olds, like they just have a blank look on their face. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So somehow
Oh
Back to
no.
the Future is not required viewing for
Yeah, I guess not.
yeah.
Yeah.
Since we mentioned it, I got to finish. Flux capacitors. That's just a made up. They put it in the movie because it sounded scientifical. I guess there's no meaning for that. Flux.
I like it.
Flux actually means the number of moles per unit area per unit time. That's the way that a
Okay.
chemical engineer uses it.
Okay. We won't mess that one up next
Okay.
time. We won't get it mixed up with time travel. We're going to jump into a little bit of a conversation about data and the role it plays in research. What are some of the key components of a successful scientific discovery, in your opinion?
The very first thing that any experiment, and it's not for coffee specifically, but any experiment, is that it has to be reproducible, and you have to have quantitative measures of the reproducibility and the statistical significance. And so, I think in terms of the coffee industry, I think a lot of people, make decisions about how good coffee is based on one or two or three coffee cuppers, tasting the coffee. And that's when you're running a business and you're on time pressure and all that, that's an effective way of doing things. If you're trying to answer rigorous questions, though, that's sample size of n=3 is not very reliable. When we did the consumer testing, and I mentioned these two cohorts, the sweet lovers and the extremophiles. We had something like 120 different people finished all of the tasting over 3 different weekends. We ended up serving about, I think it was like 3,400 individual samples of coffee over the 3 weekends. And so a huge sample size to build up enough statistics to have some confidence in our interpretation and our conclusions. I think to answer your question, yeah, you need to be able to replicate results and have some statistical significance in them. And then that's a big part of what we teach our students, how to design an experiment and then how to analyze the data. But that's only half of the battle. Like the other part is then how do we communicate those? And so a large part of graduate work is learning how to communicate via both oral presentations and, more importantly, via peer-reviewed scientific publications, and how to write those results up. Where the peer reviewers will definitely ask detailed questions about your p-values and things like that for the statistical significance of your results.
And so it sounds like statistics plays a major role in the confidence of the results. I mean, I say just loosely, but there's this experimentation portion, you're collecting all this data, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of statistics going into the research, right?
Absolutely. So my colleague Jean-Xavier Guinard, he teaches a certificate that's available to anybody, coffee industry professionals or whoever, about sensory and consumer science. And I think a lot of people kind of have the impression like, oh, I'm gonna learn how to taste things better. I'll be, become more sensitive. And then they're kind of surprised to discover that actually there's lots and lots of applied statistics. It's much more about how you analyze consumer and sensory data than it is about learning how to be a better taster. So yeah, absolutely. Like it just in general in terms of science, science specifically disclaims arguments from authority. Like I don't want anybody to I don't want anybody to believe our results because I stand up and say I'm the director of the coffee center. Therefore, this is true. The way we communicate things is by saying, here's our data. Look, here's what we did. Here are the data. Here's our sample size. Here's our 95% confidence interval. This is what the data says. This is the way we're interpreting it. That's the way that science moves forward, and that's the perspective that we're bringing to coffee.
Very cool. What tools would you recommend for our listeners at home to use to conduct their own experiments at home? So we talked a little bit about some TDS devices, but what else would you suggest?
So that's a great question. We actually struggled with this in the spring because, COVID shut the university down. Our class typically has like 500 students per quarter, but we have a nice lab here on campus, and everybody goes in, they roast and do these benchtop experiments. We had to figure out, on the drop of a dime, how to replicate that experience for students who are stuck at home using their own kitchen. And so we're actually working on revising our textbook, our lab manual, to have more of these home options. We were very motivated to minimize the amount of infrastructure they had to buy. So basically, they just had to have a coffee brewer, some way of heating water, some type of brewing device, And the one thing that we insisted they get was some way of weighing the mass. So like a food, kitchen scale,
Hmm.
preferably with zero point 0.1 gram resolution. And with that, we were able to do a series of about 8 different experiments where we, introduce people don't know anything about coffee to how coffee can taste. We introduce energy concepts. We introduce the idea of a liquid retention ratio or absorption ratio
Cool.
for
Yeah.
illustrating the conservation of mass. So I guess the number one thing I'd say is like if you're not already using a scale to weigh the mass of the coffee you're brewing with, that'd be a really good investment. You can get a pretty good scale for $20, and you'll like once you start measuring things by mass rather than by tablespoons of volume, you'll be the step one on the more quantitative journey.
What kinds of experiments would you recommend for us at home? Say we go out, we buy that $20 scale, and we're ready to do some experiments.
Well, so it depends. If you're interested in like kind of learning about how the way an engineer would approach it, which is what my class is about, a pretty, I think, fun and interesting experiment is just systematically using the same amount of water, but varying the amount of coffee grounds. So let's say you use 300 grams of water, and then you do a bunch of brews where every time you do 300 grams of water, but the first time you do 10 grams of coffee grounds, the next time 20 grams, the next time 30 grams. And each time what you do is then you just weigh, after you're done brewing, how much coffee did I actually get to drink? In other words, what was the mass of the brewed coffee? And
Mm-hmm.
if you go and then, and this is the fun data analysis part, if you then take the mass of the brew that you got and plot that, make a scatter plot. So on the vertical axis, the mass of the brew that you got, and on the horizontal axis is how much coffee grounds did I use. What you will find, if you do this carefully, is you'll find a negative correlation. So in other words, the more coffee grounds you add, the less coffee you get to drink. And so a lot of people, at least a lot of students I talk to, find that slightly counterintuitive at first. But it's really a nice illustration of the principle of conservation of mass, because what happens when you brew coffee is that not all the water goes through. You have some water gets left behind inside the coffee grounds, right? So you have
Right.
this absorbed coffee that goes in the coffee grounds by capillary inhibition and whatnot. And so when you increase the mass of the coffee grounds, you also necessarily increase the mass of water that's left behind, and so you get this negative correlation. And then if you want to take it even a step further in terms of data analysis, if you then do a linear regression, in other words, if you fit a line through those data points, the value of the slope of that line is what we call the absorption ratio. Other people call the liquid retention ratio, and usually it's around 2. So in other words, you lose 2 grams of water for every gram of coffee grounds that you put in. And so I tell people in the coffee industry that that this, and if you look at the book, there's like a nice little equation that captures this. I said that like basically this equation governs your profit margin on your drip brew coffee.
Yeah.
And if people are zoning out during the equations, then all of a sudden they start paying attention when they see that.
You say the big P word, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, I encourage our listeners to try this out. Maybe we can even do a collaboration brew with podcast listeners and figure something out. That'd be super cool. Now, I want to ask you, what are you working on? Like, what can you talk about? I know there's some stuff sort of under or behind the curtain, things you can't talk about yet, but what are things you can talk about, and how can our listeners be a part of that conversation?
Sure. I mean, so some of our work has already come out. So our first paper on the coffee brewing control chart was published in the Journal of Food Science. I think it got slowed down a little bit by the COVID outbreak, but I think it's finally out as of last month. And so you can go download that. We have a couple papers in peer review right now. What I was talking about before, the water temperature effect, and also on the consumer cohorts, the extremophiles and the sweet lovers. They're both undergoing peer review right now. We had an earlier paper on monosaccharides. We did some chemical measurements of how much sugar is present in coffee.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good thing. I can also, going back to one of your earlier questions, what was most surprising? One thing that we found, there's a lot of on the web, there's a lot of information about how the different sugars present in coffee naturally present in black coffee cause the sweetness in coffee. What we found was that there, at least in the black coffee that we analyzed, there were no perceptible sugars present at all.
That is nuts.
Yes. Yeah. So we measured very carefully 18 different monosaccharides present in coffee. And we got, quantitative, using mass spec quantitative values for all of them. And none of them, either by themselves or in combination with others, none of them were above the kind of established sensory perception thresholds for coffee. And so, but at the same time, the coffee had perceptible sweetness. And so we basically showed there that it's really not the sugars present. It's really other molecules that your mind associates with sweetness, kind of triggering a perception of sweetness, even though there's not sugar.
Yeah, like a sugary mirage or like a sugar phantom.
It's I guess so. Yeah, I mean, if you bite into a potato while blindfolded and hold an apple, under your nose, Like
What?
the potato will taste
Yeah.
sweeter just because you're getting that conflicting signal from the kind of apple aroma, which your mind associates with sweetness. So, anyways,
Oh, that's fun.
that's
Okay.
especially in terms of other things coming up. We have a really exciting set of research that we're doing right now on cold brew. So everything I was
Awesome.
talking about was like about hot drip brew. We're very delighted to partner with the Specialty Coffee Association, the Coffee Science Foundation, and with underwriting, very generous underwriting from Toddy, which
Hmm.
manufactures cold brew equipment. And so we have a couple grad students right now that we're supporting on that grant right now, and they're diving deep into extraction dynamics and sensory perceptions of cold brew coffee.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. We'll keep an eye out on that and make sure we get some links that'll be appropriate to get people over to where they can pay attention, get notifications and signals for
Yeah, I
that.
think one thing, Jesse, I should emphasize for your listeners, like the whole point of
Yeah.
the Coffee Center is we're not doing proprietary research. Everything we do, our goal is to publish it in both peer-reviewed, scientific publications,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for other scientists around the world, and also to partner with, like, for example, the SCA to disseminate in kind of plain English, what the import of those results is.
Awesome.
And so
Yeah.
everything we're going out, the only thing that we hesitate to do is like when we have work that is not quite out the door yet, we want to make sure that our grad students who are putting all their work and effort into it, get credit for it. So that's why we don't put out preprints
Yep.
and things like that.
No, it's cool. Very cool. What is the main takeaway you want our listeners to have from our conversation today?
I think the main take-home message should be that coffee science is really complicated. We are just getting started at the UC Davis Coffee Center to do, I think, a lot of really fascinating and super important research about coffee to help improve coffee, not just for consumers, in places like the United States, but to really improve quality and therefore improve demand for coffee to help people all around the world.
Well, this episode certainly changed some of the ways I think about brewing at home and how I might get creative with reducing temperature and increasing other variables, since we now better understand the role of temperature in brewing. We have one more episode in the Coffee Science series that you're not going to want to miss. We talk with a certain YouTube coffee personality about the role of coffee influencers in the world of coffee science. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.